Hello again. In the first part of the video, I talked about how language teaching until recently has been concerned with the grammatical rather than communicative approach, and I shed light on different types or ways mentioned by Nanens, and we reach to the third way in which Nanen advises his teachers to follow. So let's continue. Discourse analysis and the teaching of the language areas. Within the teaching context, discourse analysis has significant applications in the language areas of phonology, grammar, and vocabulary. The teaching of phonology interacts with the teaching of oral discourse. Phonology, in particular, the prosodic or suprasegmental elements, provides the range of possible rhythm and intonation combinations. Yet the context is what determines the most appropriate choice of prosody in any given situated utterance. The general pragmatic strategy used by English speakers, for example, is to de-emphasize given information, which is meant here what is already known, and emphasize new information, thereby utilizing prosody for information management and interaction management. In other words, in any language class where oral skills are taught, the interaction of classroom and prosody must be highlighted and taught. Since contextually appropriate control of rhythm and intonation are an essential part of oral communicative competence. A discourse-oriented approach to grammar places importance both on the text within which grammatical points are presented and on the connecting roles fulfilled by the various grammatical forms. As McCarthy, 1991, claims, a grammar is seen to have a direct role in welding clauses, terms, and sentences into discourse. Knowing grammar can no longer mean knowing only how a form functions within a given sentence, but must also include discourse features of grammatical forms. Thus, knowing the tense aspect system in English cannot mean only knowing which forms constituent each tense aspect combination, but must also mean knowing how each tense aspect combination can be used to create temporal continuity as well as signaling other relationships within the larger text. Students learning a new language need to become aware of the repertoire of grammatical choices in that language. But more importantly, they need to become aware of the conditioning roles of discourse and context, which guides the language user in making appropriate choices. It is the context-dependent and pragmatic rules of grammar that play an important role in a discourse approach to grammar. In English, such grammatical choices as passive versus active voice, sentential position of adverbs, tense aspect modality sequences, and article use, among others, are context dependent. So we depend on context to explain these. A similar list of context-sensitive rules can be generated for any language. In all such cases, In all such cases, the speaker writer's ability to produce the form or construction accurately is but part of a much larger process in which the semantic, pragmatic, and discourse appropriateness of the form itself is also judged with respect to the context in which it is used. So context plays a vital role. Similarly, the interpretation process can be facilitated or hindered depending on the learner's understanding of what functions a given grammatical form plays within the given context. Some of the most obvious structural features of connected discourse are the type of cohesive ties identified and discussed by Halliday and Hassan 1976 and 1989, reference, substitution, ellipses, and conjunction. Textual cohesion is achieved by choosing among and using these cohesive devices appropriately. Speakers and writers incorporate them as they produce text, and listeners and readers attend to them as they interpret text. And the teaching and learning of vocabulary. The discourse perspective stands out very clearly. Vocabulary cannot be taught or learned out of text. It is only within larger pieces of a discourse that the intended meaning of words becomes clear. Granted, one could claim that most content words have one or more basic dictionary definitions, which could be learned as such, but the intended and complete meaning of a word can only be derived from the combination of a given dictionary meaning and the contextual frame within which the word appears. Furthermore, when talking about learners of another language, we must remember that the so-called equivalent words in two different languages might function quite differently in terms of collocations, range of specific meanings, and typical discourse functions. Vocabulary can be literal or figurative, with figurative language including idiomatic use and metaphorical use. For example, a sentence such as, "He got the axe," may mean literally that some male person fished a tool for chopping wood, or figuratively that he was fired from his job, terminated. The interpretation one arrives at may well depend on the context. If the discourse continues and he chopped down the tree, the literal interpretation takes hold. If the subsequent discourse is, "So now he is looking for another job," the figurative interpretation is the coherent one. The language learner needs both to acquire a word's potential range of meaning and to be able to recognize the particular meaning which is compatible with the context and the discourse within which the word appears. Although this is true for any vocabulary item, in a general sense, this is especially true of a large number of vocabulary items which have specialized meaning when used within a particular context. A specialized field such as biology or physics may well have three types of vocabulary. One, a core vocabulary it shares with all sciences and technologies. A specific vocabulary for its own branch of science. and even more specific vocabulary, primarily to those in a specific sub-area, like, for example, microbiology or plasma physics. Words that serve a discourse function rather than expressing semantic content are much more dependent on context for their meaning and use. For example, the English function word else is a useful and relatively frequent lexical item. Yet, it is not well treated in ESL and EFL textbooks, where sentence level grammar and vocabulary exercises are the norm. Like other reference words, for example, personal pronouns, demonstratives, etc., else generally requires some prior discourse for its interpretation. Sentence level exercises, because it is an exercise, so there is no text, no context, cannot possibly convey to non-native speakers the importance of the word else and the ways in which it is used in English. What is needed are many fully contextualized examples taken or adapted from authentic materials to provide learners with the necessary exposure to and practice with else, a function word that is semantically, grammatically, and textually complex. The fourth way, discourse analysis and the teaching of the language skills. When using language for communication, we are faced with two major types of processes. Two major types: transmitting our ideas and intentions to an addressee, or interpreting and understanding the text or message produced by an interlocutor. The first, which is transmitting, places the initiator of the discourse at the production end of the continuum, while the second, which is interpreting, the second places the interpreter at the reception end. When producing discourse, we combine discourse knowledge with strategies of speaking. So we combine both discourse knowledge with what? With strategies of speaking or writing, while utilizing audience relevant contextual support. When interpreting discourse, we combine both discourse knowledge with the strategies of listening. So please pay attention with me. When I'm going to repeat, when producing discourse, we combine, when producing discourse, we combine discourse knowledge with what? With the strategies of speaking or writing, while utilizing audience relevant contextual support. Now, when interpreting discourse and interpretation, we combine discourse knowledge with strategies of listening or reading, while relying on prior knowledge as well as on assessment of the context at hand. The language skills can be grouped in two different ways. We can talk about productive versus receptive skills, or we can talk about the skills which refer to spoken language versus those that refer to written language. For productive skills, learners need, pay attention with me, learners need to develop effective communication strategies based on either oral or written production. For receptive skills, learners need to develop interpretation skills. So they need to develop interpretation skills related to either listening to or reading a text. Yet, for each skill, the language user requires unique strategies. For interactive listening, for example, language learners need to develop strategies and routines that elicit clarifications, repetitions, and elaborations from the speaker in order to facilitate the comprehension process when she or he is having interpretation difficulties. So language learners need to develop strategies and routines that elicit clarification, repetition, and elaboration from the speaker. Why? In order to facilitate the comprehension process, to comprehend what is said, the comprehension process when she or he is having interpretation difficulties. It seems therefore that when using the spoken language in a face-to-face exchange, it is necessary to resort to a variety of compensatory skills to overcome lack of language resources, since the nature of oral exchange is such that immediate remedies have to be found in order to maintain the flow of speech. This can be true for both the speaker and the listener. So the speaker lacking linguistic knowledge may resort to situational and other contextual features to make himself or herself understood, to use different words, to paraphrase, to play around the words, to make himself or herself understood, while the listener makes use of similar features in order to understand. Prior and shared knowledge for receptive skills at the macro processing stage involves activation of schematic and contextual knowledge. Schematic and contextual knowledge. Please pay attention to these two. Schematic knowledge is generally thought of as two types of prior knowledge. Content schemata and formal schemata. Content schemata, which are the background information on the topic and relevant socio-cultural knowledge, while formal schemata are knowledge of how discourse is organized with respect to different journals, different topics, or different purposes. So this is the schemata, activation of schemata, and now we will move to contextual knowledge. Contextual knowledge. I talked about schematic knowledge, and I mentioned that there are two types of schemata knowledge. Two types. It is content schemata and formal schemata. Concerning contextual knowledge, it is the overall perception of the specific listening or reading situation. Here it means that listeners observe who the participants are, what the setting is, what the topic and purpose are, while readers consider the place where the text appeared, who wrote it, and for what purposes. Listeners and readers also make use of their understanding of the ongoing discourse or context. In that, listeners remember what has already been said and anticipate what is likely to be said next, while readers consider the title of the text and subtext, the larger framework within which the text appeared, etc. In teaching language, the teacher should exploit the processing features that listening and reading skills share. Language teachers can provide learners with a variety of listening activities, which will engage them in listening practice at the discourse level. During such activities, it is important that learners have the opportunity to combine the following. Combine recognition of phonological signals, such as stress, pause, and intonation, and recognition of lexical grammatical signals, such as discourse markers, lexical phrases, and word order. Knowledge of content organization and incorporation of contextual features are needed also. A successful and effective listener will combine all of the above mentioned types or strategies or features in an attempt to understand the spoken message. A variety of other activities can be developed to accommodate the changing environment within which listening becomes crucial. For example, voicemail systems and telephone answering machines are important instances of authentic listening to which students should be exposed. Also, recording of interactive telephone conversations during which students are asked to listen first, and then interpret and sum up what they have heard. As I ask you now, when I ask you to listen to this video and then sum up what you have heard here. This can be helpful practical listening activities. It can also be useful for second language learners to listen to recorded segments of radio or TV news broadcasts, as well as to short lectures on a variety of topics. Material developers and curriculum planners need to incorporate such listening experiences into the language classroom. In addition, one must not forget that even advanced level foreign language learners may experience micro level problems in decoding the normal stream of speech while listening. In some cases, the overall context compensates for such a problem. In other words, it does not, for example, the university student listening to a lecture who hears communist instead of communist may misunderstand an entire lecture segment, because there are two different words which mean different things. Therefore, attention should be given to issues of segmentation and phonemic decoding, as well as to the global features described above when teaching listening skills to learners. In order to process a written text rather than a spoken one, now let's talk about the written one. The reader has to perform a number of simultaneous tasks. First, decode the message by recognizing the written science. Then, interpret the message by assigning meaning to the string of written words. And finally, figure out the author's intention. In this process, there are at least three participants: the writer, the text, and the reader. Researchers in this field have been studying and describing the interactive nature of the reading process since the late 1970s. The reading task requires readers to choose, select, and apply some of what they know to each new text. It seems that good readers do this very effectively, while poorer readers encounter many difficulties. Now, a well-written text exhibits two important features which facilitate its interpretation during the reading process: coherence and cohesion. Coherence is the quality that makes a text conform to a consistent world view based on one's experience, culture, or convention. It can also be viewed as a feature of the text which incorporates the ways and means by which ideas, concepts, and propositions are presented. Coherence is the result of a reader's appropriate response to the writer's plan and relates to the discourse word of written text, to pragmatic features, and to a content area. It usually fits a conventionally and culturally acceptable rhetorical tradition in terms of sequence and structure. In the process of interpreting a written text, the reader assesses his or her specific purpose for reading and then recruits his or her knowledge of the word, previous experience of reading, and familiarity with writing conventions and different types of genres to arrive at that degree of interpretation deemed necessary. Cohesion refers to those overt features of a text which provide surface evidence for its unity and connectedness. Cohesion is realized linguistically by devices and ties, which are elements or units of language used to form the larger text. Since cohesion relies heavily on grammatical and lexical devices, deficiencies in the reader's linguistic competence may cause the reader to miss important cohesive links and, as a result, to have difficulties in the interpretation process. The language learner needs to develop good strategies of combining linguistic knowledge with the other types of knowledge, the types mentioned above, in order to apply them all simultaneously in the interpretation process. Reading courses should provide learners with activities that help them develop strategies employing all the types of knowledge related to the interpretation process. Personal involvement in such reading activities would most likely result in the development of effective and individual reading strategies. A discourse-oriented reading course will allow learners to negotiate their interaction with text by constantly involving them in making choices and decisions with respect to text. Learners need to engage in the processing of a large stock of multi-purpose reading matter in order to become independent and strategic readers. The combination of intensive work on the knowledge of component and ample exposure to processing activities makes for a successful reading course. However, in order to ensure the development of strategic readers, the teacher must also devote attention to reader awareness and metacognition. These encourage learners to become independent readers and to regulate their interpretation strategies during the reading process. Writing, when viewed as a language skill for communication, has much in common with both reading and speaking. It shares the features of written text and reading, and it shares the production process with the speaking. The writer communicates his or her ideas in the form of written text from which none or unknown readers will eventually extract their ideas and meanings. The writer is responsible, therefore, for creating a well-written text that has cohesion and coherence and takes the potential reader's background knowledge into account. Learners need to gain practice in writing within the language classroom so as to develop experience and effective strategies for a reader-based approach, which continually considers and accommodates an absent reader audience. A writer cannot rely on the context to provide support for interpretation. In fact, writing competence develops as a gradual liberation from the dependence on context for meaning. This liberation is achieved through skillful mastery of the potential linguistic repertoire matched with effective use of conventional rhetoric through a revision process leading to the written text. Furthermore, successful adult academic writing is the result of the writer's autonomous and decontextualized production process, which in turn results in texts that are self-contained and potentially communicative to readers who are removed in place and time from the writing process itself. While cohesion, as mentioned above, relies heavily on grammatical knowledge, coherence is grounded in the thinking process. An important consideration in the creation of coherence in a text is the choice of genre and rhetorical format, which in turn is closely related to one's purpose for writing. At the most general level, we distinguish between the narrative genre and factual or expository writing. McCarthy and Carter, 1994, refer to these as the two prototype genres. The narrative is structured around a chronological development of events and is centered on a protagonist of the narration. Consequently, a narrative is usually personalized or individualized and tells about the event related to the person or persons involved. So it is personalized. And expository text on the other hand, has no chronological organization, but rather a logical one, and is usually objective and factual in nature. Both types of writing may be important in the language classroom, but it is the expository text which requires the type of training and experience that only the classroom can provide. One of the important features of a well-formed text is the unity and connectedness which make the individual sentences and the text hang together or relate to each other. This unity is partially a result of the coherent organization of the propositions and ideas in the passage. So this is partially. But it also depends considerably on the painstaking process carried out by the writer in order to create formal and grammatical cohesion among the paragraphs and among the sentences in each paragraph. The speaking skill, although sharing the production process with the writing skill, is very different from the act of writing, since spoken language happens in the here and now and must be produced and processed online. In such oral communication, there is always room for mismatches and misunderstandings, which could derive from any of the followings. Number one, the speaker does not have full command to the target language and produces an unacceptable form. This is one thing. The necessary background knowledge is not shared by the speaker and the hearer, and the speaker and the hearer, and they bring different expectations to the spoken interaction. There is no shared knowledge. The speaker and the hearer do not share socio-cultural rules of appropriateness, and therefore the speaker may have violated such a rule from the hearer's point of view due to pragmatic transfer from the first language. The basic assumption in any oral interaction is that the speaker wants to communicate ideas, feelings, attitudes, and information to the hearers, or wants to employ speech that relates to the situation. The objective of the speaker is to be understood and for the message to be properly interpreted by the hearer or the hearers. It is the speaker's intention that needs to be communicated to her or his audience. However, a faulty production in any one of the above three areas could create a piece of spoken discourse that is misunderstood. In an attempt to ensure proper interpretation by the hearer, the speaker has to be concerned with the factors of medium, which are linguistically controlled, as well as the factors of appropriateness, which are pragmatically controlled by the speech situation and by the prevailing cultural and social norms. Factors of medium relate to the speaker's linguistic competence, as well as to the possibility of faulty delivery of the spoken utterance. The language learner needs to constantly improve his or her mastery of linguistic and socio-cultural knowledge while gaining ample experience in spoken communicative interaction in order to develop useful speech production strategies. These strategies are most important in overcoming linguistic and other types of deficiencies that often are typical of non-native speakers. As a conclusion, the biggest obstacle with regard to moving beyond ad hoc approaches to communicative language teaching and arriving at a communicative approach that is fully informed by discourse analysis as both the theoretical and practical levels is to provide language teachers and other teaching professionals like curriculum developers, textbook writers, language testers, etc., with the proper grounding in discourse analysis. Many language teaching professionals receive training in grammar, in phonetics, and the teaching of the language skills, such as reading, writing, and speaking. A few programs also include a theoretical course in discourse analysis, but such a course generally does not make practical connections with the language classroom. Courses in pedagogical discourse analysis are still the exception in teacher training programs, despite the fact that a body of appropriate pedagogical material exists. The need for professional training in pedagogical discourse analysis is clear not only for the second and foreign language teachers, but also for the first language educators and literacy specialists also. Until training catches up with need appropriate reading materials in surface training and with the professional conferences, these ways will fill the gap that we need to link grammar with discourse analysis. Language teachers also require training in cross-cultural communication. Since many modern classrooms are multicultural in nature, a multicultural class may be composed of new immigrants of different ethnic groups. Each of these groups comes from a specific cultural background, which may contain discourse and interactional features that are different from the target language promoted by the school system, and which may even be unfamiliar to the teacher and the other faculty at school. In such multicultural context, it is important for all personnel to become aware of cultural differences and to learn to respect them, so that they do not unwittingly penalize learners for being different from the target culture while adhering perfectly to the norms of their own culture. Here, the notion of shared knowledge relates to the student's background. It is something that teachers must be aware of, and that should guide teachers in selecting materials and teaching procedures for their classes. Here we reach to the end of the second lecture, which is the second part of the lecture, discourse analysis and language teaching. And here also I need your feedback to sum up the main ideas of this lecture. Thank you very much.